so much, everyone, for coming to the 7th event of our symposium. Today's event is titled Competing Jurisdictions, the Struggle for Indigenous Self-Determination. And I'm very honored to have two distinguished guests, as well as Professor Billy Stratton as our moderator. And first, I will introduce Professor Stratton, and then he will further introduce our speakers for today. Professor Stratton is originally from Eastern Kentucky. He studied literature and philosophy at Miami University and then earned a PhD in American Indian Studies program from the University of Arizona, among the first 30 in the discipline worldwide. He has taught courses that span Native American and contemporary American literature, Native and Indigenous studies, apocalypse, Southern Gothic and New West literature, postmodernism, creative writing, and film studies. He has published on captivity narratives, colonialism, war, and Native American critical theory, while his criticism has been focused on contemporary writers such as Laura Toei, Gerald Vizinor, Stephen Graham Jones, James Welch, and Sherman Alexie. His first book, Buried in the Shades of Night, was published in 2013, while current projects include a critical collection of the work of Stephen Graham Jones and a novel set in Appalachian coal country. Professor Stratton recently served as a Fulbright Scholar in the American Studies program at Julius Maximilians Universität Würzburg, Germany, and has lectured in Sydney, Canberra, Leiden, Berlin, Leipzig, Mainz, Heidelberg, Bonn, and Vienna, among other places. So with that, I will pass it over to Professor Stratton.
Thank y'all for being here, but thanks to the Center on Rights and Development for organizing this symposium. We're going to have two speakers today, and each speaker will first present their presentations, and then after that we'll have room for a Q&A. So the first speaker, Elifuraha Laltaika. He's a founder and executive director of the Association for Law and Advocacy for Pastoralists. He is a law lecturer at Tumaini University, Makumira, Tanzania, and founder of the Association for Law and Advocacy for Pastoralists. It's a nonprofit organization that defends rights of traditional pastoralists and hunter-gatherers. He's also a Fulbright alumnus and holds a Master of Law from the University of Oregon Law School, Master of Laws from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Dar es Salaam. He was Dean of the Faculty of Law at Tumaini University, member of a technical advisory panel of the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, consultant for the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and Senior Indigenous Fellow at the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Geneva. He's written book chapters and several law review articles focusing primarily on the plight of indigenous communities in Africa in relation to international environmental and human rights law and standards. He's licensed to practice law in Tanzania mainland. Mr. Laltaika has taken part in training in Tanzania's High Court judges and staff of the National Human Rights Institution on international law and indigenous people's rights, and has also delivered guest lectures in universities in the U.S., Denmark, and the Philippines. He is currently a Doctor of Laws candidate at the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program at the University of Arizona, writing a dissertation on the impacts of extractive industries on communities and environments of Tanzania. So welcome, Dr. Our second speaker is Peter Van Arsdale. He's a PhD adjunct professor here at the University of Denver. He is the director of African Initiatives at the University of Denver, where he also serves as an adjunct professor. He is an applied cultural anthropologist with foci in East Africa, Southeast Asia, the Balkans, Latin America, and North America, specializing on human rights, community, water resources, refugee settlement, and humanitarian intervention. Dr. Van Arsdale is also a senior researcher at eCross Culture Corporation, and a noted author, journal editor, and former president of the National Association for the Practice of Anthropology, and is known for his tree of rights and theory of obligation ideas. He is a co-founder of the Denver Hospice and has studied a band of previously uncontacted Sitak and Kurawai people in Indonesia and Guinea. Since 1979, he has been a fellow of the Explorers Club. Let's welcome Dr. Van Arsdale. So at this point, we'll turn it over to soon-to-be Dr. Laltaika. Give you more information about his research interests.
Thank you, Billy, for a very kind introduction. And also for the gift of the journal to read it. I'm very much delighted to be part of this famous symposium, a very, very prestigious School of International Studies. And even more for being invited to talk about Indigenous people's rights, because it's an area of human rights law that I'm really passionate about, not because of scholarly interests alone, but also because I'm a member actually of the community that self-identifies as Indigenous in Tanzania, and a member of the National Pastoralists. So this is sort of an area that really I have a lot of interest in. I've titled my paper Prospects and Challenges to Realizing Indigenous People's Rights to Self-Determination in Africa. Now probably the starting point is in 1965 when a very celebrated novelist in Kenya called Elifuraha wrote a book called The River Between. And in that book he was actually describing a river that divides two villages because one village professed the traditional religion and the another converted to Christianity, and there was a conflict because they could not understand each other. 50 years down the road, I can see a similar river actually in Africa, and this time it divides the communities that self-identify as indigenous from the government or policy makers in the respective government. And it actually impacts on other rights because, of the confusion surrounding the concept of self-determination that I'm addressing. So this confusion on what precisely is the meaning of self-determination, the contours, the limits, has really been problematic because it causes a government not to really respect the rights of indigenous people. So it's sort of a blockage. But you cannot talk of contemporary rights of indigenous people without actually addressing some colonial history. And you can agree with me that we don't have time to go through a lot of intricacies surrounding colonization and decolonization. But I think I have to mention two things. That much as colonialism was really a problem to all, was inherently dehumanizing, it was inherently bad to all colonized communities. But that fact aside, colonial administration operated by really isolating some groups and declare them as favored communities within the country. And so that one, combined by the fact that colonialism, because it actually needed some raw materials, agricultural raw materials to feed industries in the West, caused a lot of disparities in Africa. See, so I need to get that clear, that colonialism was very bad, inherently dehumanizing, but colonial policy could not operate without some disintegration, some sort of divide and rule. And on top of that, there were communities that could not really be assimilated to the colonial economy. They were practicing livelihood options that were seen as archaic and anti-developmental, and the pastoralism and the hunting and gathering. Pastoralism can sound a little bit unclear, but is traditional cattle heading. So the British colonialists did not really take time too much with these communities. They just assisted agriculturalists to really improve the agricultural ways so that they can get crops to feed industries in the West. And what was the problem with that? In fact, after the end of colonialism, there were very high level disparities because these traditional communities, meaning hunter-gatherers and pastoralists, were left behind. In fact, laws systematically discriminated against them, and there was a very high level stereotype. But good luck, we got our independence. What happened after independence is that many African countries actually adopted colonial laws and without changing them. And by not changing those laws, it actually meant that the same stereotypes, the same discrimination, the same level of discrimination against hunter-gatherers and pastoralists was carried out by independent government. And there is irrefutable evidence to that effect in Africa. Anyone going to Africa, you will hear that there are some communities that are associated with backwardness. They are associated with anti-development initiative. Their livelihoods are not given policy priority. And again, they are two dominant communities, the pastoralists and hunter-gatherers. So even now, the issue of government supporting this livelihood system is seen as really backward because of the mentality that inherently these livelihoods should be discouraged, should be eliminated. Now, another difference that I should say is that unlike the West settler states like New Zealand, the US, Canada, and so on and so forth, decolonization in Africa was a little bit different in the sense that it did not result in the creation of a dominant settler economy which could assist you in differentiating and saying these are indigenous people and these are not. So in that sense, it just was a sort of handling power, including land administration to natives, elites belonging to the same African communities. But what is the significance of that problem is that it is now very difficult for communities that want to use the indigenous rubric, which is very well developed internationally, to sort of claim their rights locally. Because what you are told immediately by the government is that, oh, we are all indigenous. Don't bring these concepts that are applicable in New Zealand and the US and Australia, because we are all indigenous. So this narrative of dismissing the need to address rights that have historical connection became very persistent actually. It was very entrenched until the African Commission on Human and People's Rights took over. And the Commission is an intergovernmental organization that has been created by the African Charter. It's a human rights institution based in Banjul, the Gambia. So in a meeting that was conducted in my hometown in Arusha, one commissioner from South Africa attended, and indigenous people, including scholars, tried to narrate and connect these issues affecting those communities in Africa with the human rights of indigenous peoples globally. And so from that time, the issues of indigenous people became widespread in Africa despite those sort of problems. But you can talk of all rights of indigenous people except the right to self-determination is regarded as very offensive in Africa. And now if you ask me what that is a problem, I would really agree with African governments, given our history of really having a lot of civil strife and having nation states that are a conglomeration of lot of tribes, so they really need some space to sort of have cohesions, to make some nations out of different groups, like 100 plus ethnic groups claiming one nationality. That is the reason that I can quickly pick. But there is a very famous professor called Professor Issa Shift, writing on international law. He gives me yet another reason, and I would quote very quickly. Professor Issa Shift says that the problem in Africa has been precisely that existing states have not treated nations and nationalities under them democratically. Hence, their fear that recognition of this right to self-determination will lead to secession. You see, so that is what Professor saying is a cause for not really, accepting any claims on self-determination, whatever the meaning as we can see. But despite all those challenges, I can very confidently say that rights, indigenous people's rights in Africa are really gaining traction, and slowly governments are implementing rights that are contained in the United Nations Declaration. And very quickly I can pick 3 examples, is that the Central African Republic has ratified Convention 169 of International Labour Organization, which is the most comprehensive law actually with binding obligations. So that is really a plus for Africa, and it defeats narratives by some scholars that we not have indigenous people in Africa. Secondly, my own country, Tanzania, has actually issued a certificate of land to the hunter-gatherers in their own name. And to understand the importance of this as a very groundbreaking decision, laws of Tanzania are modeled around colonial laws, not recognizing traditional institutions for the purpose of land holding. So it came as a surprise for us that the government decided to issue a certificate that actually recognizes the vulnerabilities of hunter-gatherers, because there are probably 5,000, and you want them to belong to a village of 500 people, for example, so they are marginalized, they cannot even decide. Everything can be done very democratically to dispossess them of their land. But lastly, in South Africa there's a very important development, both constitutional and legislative, relating to land restitution. Thabo Mbeki, former president, when he was a vice president, actually addressed the media and saying, by land restitutions in South Africa, we are actually telling the whole world that we are committed to fulfilling our pledge internationally with regards to the rights of indigenous people. So those 3 developments are sort of emblematic of the fact that not too bad, things are changing, albeit slowly. I don't want to overwhelm you with a lot of details of how indigenous people's rights came to the continent. But let me say very briefly that unlike in Africa, the rest of the world actually started these movements in the 60s, going to Geneva and so on and so forth. And Professor Naya, one of the foremost specialists in this, the intersection between indigenous people's rights and international law, says it was because indigenous people got some training on their rights, and also there was abundant literature on their rights, so they decided to go to pursue some rights at the international level. But for Africans, Africans started in 1989, and there are 3 reasons why Africans were late to join this global movement. Number one, by the end of the 60s, probably 1970s, when these movements became very widespread in Geneva, African countries were very newly independent. And what does that mean? One, there was completely no space for a specific segment of the community to claim separate rights. It was forbidden. There was no legal policy space. But another one, the flip side, is that of course everyone was hopeful that things will change, because we were just attaining independence, and there were a lot of pre-independence promises. So everyone was looking forward to the government pledging or fulfilling its pledge. But number two, the other is lack of a critical mass of educated indigenous people. Colonialism, you would agree with me, was not concerned with developing Africans. So universities, probably in Tanzania, for example, by 1961, there was no university. There was a college offering law as an extended college of East Africa. You see, so you can agree at that time, and save for the lucky few who went to England to study, the majority could not really get college education, so it was really difficult for them to engage on what was happening internationally, both at the national level, and I think matters were even worse when you come down to indigenous peoples themselves. That's why it is actually until 1993 that an anthropologist from Tanzania, Lazaro Pakipuni, was invited to Canada. When he was addressing, was talking in a human rights panel, he actually showed some connections between his people, the Maasai pastoralists in Tanzania, with the indigenous people's rights globally. That was really groundbreaking and eye-opening, because after his paper, it was circulated, and indigenous people elsewhere in Africa really picked it from there. And the last reason is given by a Danish anthropologist called Yen Dam, writing the history of indigenous people globally, and he says it was very dangerous in Africa. You see, you say anything relating to indigenous people, that was highly damaging. In fact, he went to jail. And he is documenting actually some of his friends in Africa who had to suffer just by going or attending meetings and talk about indigenous people's issues. But you may ask what has changed, because that was just in the 80s and 20 years or 30 at most. What has changed? One thing, what I mentioned earlier, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. This is an intergovernmental organization, so governments have very high regard. They don't fund it in a manner that it can fulfill all its mandates by the charter, but it actually has very high respect in the continent. So when it started to engage, it used its mandate of sensitization to invite some government officers to seminars, and they could connect some dots and say, oh wow, these things are not as bad as we thought. So they are not, issues of indigenous peoples are no longer criminal, because an intergovernmental body has addressed it, and this is the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. But over the years, the Commission, because if you talk of indigenous peoples in Africa, this should actually be the bedrock, the first starting point for many reasons. But one is a report, because after accepting conceptually that there are indigenous peoples in Africa, it actually passed a resolution that established a working group of experts. And this working group of experts sort of came up with a very robust report that is actually cited as a canonical source, is a signature piece really of indigenous people's claims in Africa. And luckily for all of us in Africa, it actually mentions specifically those societies that we also self-identify as indigenous. So for us, it became very easy because we go to Dar es Salaam, to Nairobi, to any capital, and if they tell you that, oh, we don't have indigenous people in our country, you show them a report by a commission that they formed. It's a government report by extension, because they are all members of the African Union, and in that connection, the African Commission on Human People's Rights. To finish up on the African Commission, apart from the robust report that I read it, I've probably read it like 10 times, and I really like it, the way it has really solved all the problems of surrounding the confusion as to whether we have indigenous people or not. Again, it occasionally issues resolutions. So whenever there's a confusion globally with regards to indigenous people's rights in Africa, this commission sits and sends a resolution to African governments. Recently it issued it to the World Bank, showing that we have indigenous people in Africa, and the World Bank should not revise its operational policies in a manner that would negatively impact on indigenous people's rights. So you would agree with me that it is the Commission actually that is doing a lot of other things. But that apart, it decided a case, a communications, involving the Elifuraha community. The Elifuraha community are pastoralists in Kenya who were evicted from their land. The government just decided to chase them away without compensation, and they went to courts in Kenya, unsuccessful, and they decided to go to the African Commission and try their luck. And they used the indigenous people's rubric, saying by not being given their land, their rights to culture, their religion rights are really interfered, and those rights are protected by the African Charter. And in a very encouraging way, the Commission actually decided in the favor of the community, and it issued a very highly quoted landmark decisions. But unfortunately, to date, it has not been implemented. The last time I was in Africa, indigenous peoples from Kenya were coming to my hometown in Arusha, where we have the African court that issues binding decisions. Lawyers would agree with me that commission, just like the commission here, it does not issue binding decisions. So it was a good decision, but as a matter of international law, is not binding. So to enforce it, they wanted to go to the African court, sitting in my home country and hometown in Arusha, to sort of push or force the government of Kenya to implement that decision. And what would the implementation mean? It would actually mean taking back the community to their land. That's what the commission decided. Trying to run this time. But, I have 7 minutes. I thought I could unpack a little bit about the right to self-determination. And this is very important part of my presentation. Because as I said, it's a problem everywhere. Initially, how to understand the right to self-determination is to connect it with human. It's a human right, just like the right to food, the right to health, and so on and so forth. So don't have in mind a state when you hear the right to self-determination, and that is a problem with many people if you make it a little survey. It is very well documented. The highly ratified conventions, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and its counterparts on economic, social, and cultural rights. Both in Article 1, they actually contain these rights. And also the African Charter has a right to self-determination. I can say it is a right like any other rights, and it has duty bearers and right holders. Right holders are oppressed groups within countries, independent countries, and the duty bearers are governments. But regardless of this clear-cut distinction of who are duty bearers, and I must emphasize that it is not by any way a clear concept. But some scholars who have tried to simplify it are saying that there is external self-determination and internal self-determination. The external is the need for independent statehood, and by internal is a need for social reorientation in order to, have a say within a state. And attainment of political independence does not rule out the possibility, or does not invalidate this right. So this right survives even attainment of independence. And no group, even with the internal self-determination that I said, it's a need for internal reordering of systems in order to level playing field and to probably build bridges to make sure all societies, including indigenous peoples in a country, enjoy human rights. It is also not limited. It also includes the right to secession or to independent statehood if the people so decide. And that is a source of confusion and disagreement among scholars. But there is one limitation called state sovereignty. So state sovereignty sort of limits the right to self-determination. I don't want to go to the historical development of this right, but it featured in Babin's article on the Republica, and it was highly modified by Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes said the sovereign is the most powerful person on the land, and how he gets that power is none of the business of the subjects, and that was the source of the problem, because historians tell us actually that colonialism operated under that conception, Hobbesian concept of sovereignty, that once you go to Africa, for example, and you dominate, then you are sovereign. Your laws will reign above the laws of the indigenous people informed in that. But, all scholars I've surveyed, including Professor Robert Williams from the University of Arizona, a very prolific writer on Native Americans and indigenous peoples globally, is saying it's something good. Sovereignty, if it is used as a tool for national cohesion, then it is something we can all embrace. And Professor Anaya as well is supporting that indigenous people in a modern era that the whole globe is divided into states. It's very difficult to imagine that any claim for sovereignty, for self-determination, presupposes or has an agenda of independent statehood. Of course, you would agree with me that there are differences, but the general rule is that for indigenous people, they just need to be given some space, like other peoples, to enjoy fruits of the nations, because they have been victims of discrimination and violations of rights for generations. But a very critical scholar again, Professor Isa Shiv, Tanzanian writer of international law, is saying the problem of uplifting the right, state sovereignty to trump over self-determination is to give states a license to perpetuate their status quo and actually rid self-determination of its important aspect of anti-imperialism. So it becomes very difficult for people within a state to escape from a state of disempowerment. So it's something that also needs some revisiting. But the general rule is that once sovereignty is used in a manner or as an accomplice, as a tool for oppression, it loses its validity. History abound with a lot of examples to that effect. Even in South Africa, that is what brought the end to apartheid, because it was really a sovereign state in that matter. But that sovereignty was used as a tool or as an accomplice for state oppression. And on that matter, I thank you. If there be questions, I will be able to, I'll be glad to respond.
You can think about your questions and hold them until our next presenter has told us what he's going to tell us.
Good.
I'll hand it
Questions
over
after both of us, that's
to
perfect.
Dr. Benner.
Thanks so much. I'm going to stand for just a moment, then I'll be seated too, and I'll use this microphone. My presentation is entitled Issues of Sovereignty and Self-Determination in Papua, Indonesia. I can't speak for this man. He's a friend of mine. I can't speak for this man because that would be presumptuous. But I've spoken with this man and with other people, men and women, in Papua. That's what you think of as the Indonesian part of Western New Guinea. It's now Papua or West Papua, Indonesia, not the nation of Papua New Guinea, but the other side of the island, the west side of the island. But I'm going to share with you today things that relate to this gentleman's concerns as it relates, and I think you'll find it very nicely complements what we've heard. It's like he and I planned our presentations 6 months in advance together, but we hadn't, with Bill's good help. And in that regard, just keep this nice man's face in your mind, because as different as he seems to look, of course he's no different than the rest of us. He's just another interesting person, an indigenous person of Papua, Indonesia. Does each person have my one-page handout that our colleagues were nice enough to share? We have handouts for each and every person, and I do ask you to reference these because as I go, I'll be referencing the names of persons and the names of groups on this one-page handout. And of course, it's a souvenir. You can take it home if you want. In the Indonesian language, which I'll use only minimally to make key points, if you see the letter C, as we transliterate it here, it's pronounced cha, not sa. So when you see the letter C in a couple of the Indonesian words here, you'll know to put the CH sound to it, and you'll be right with me, and you'll be able to pronounce these names. So my presentation today is about something very close to my heart, based on work I began 40 years ago when I was completing my doctorate in Indonesia, New Guinea, Papua, Indonesia, and which has remained close to my heart for these last 40 years, even though I've had a chance to now work in other areas of the world, and most recently work in East Africa, which I certainly enjoy. But your first field site, where you meet those first important people, never leaves you, and they frame you, and they help you, and you think back on them. And I remember someone said as I was completing my doctorate in the University of Colorado nearly those 40 years ago, "You think your work in New Guinea will make a difference in anything else?" And I said, "Yes, it will." And it has. And I think about it regularly, and it frames things that I try to do to the best of my ability, whether I'm in East Africa, in the Balkans, or in Southeast Asia. So this presentation is not one that I've made before in this way, because I'm framing it entirely around actors and stories associated with the actors and a couple of the organizations that you see listed on this handout that you have. Now I frame my work, because there's nothing like a good theory. We don't want to over-theorize, but there's nothing like a good one. And I frame much of my work, as I know some of you good folks do, around the issues of structural violence and the notion of structural violence. And Monica Heller, a fellow anthropologist, has recently come up with some statements about structural violence that certainly build upon what Paul Farmer and others of our friends that we've talked to and written about have said, but she said it in a more powerful way, at least as it relates to my interest in Papua Indonesia. Monica Heller stresses that deaths, disappearances, and displacements are generated by dehumanizing processes. Structural violence allows difference to be made, such that destruction and appropriation can readily be engaged. Symbolic and physical violence enable one another. The state makes rules to legitimize turning some people, their things, and their lands into available resources. As I've written, structural violence isn't always violent. It's not always physically violent, but it's institutionally embedded in these ways which are harmful. So I believe that frame, a frame derived, and I thank Monica Heller, a frame derived from understandings of structural violence is helpful to considering Papua Indonesia. So I'm going to cover, in the time I have available, about 40 plus years of developments in an area that not too many folks at DU have heard about. It doesn't always reach the headlines as some other important areas, including important areas most recently in East Africa. But I'll tell you, I've sure learned a lot reflecting on it, and I hope I might be able to share a bit with you folks. The first name you'll see on my little handout sheet, remembering that C is CH, is Awuchinam. Awuchinam was a grandfatherly figure that I met in the village of Owus in the Asmat region of what we now call Papua Indonesia, Indonesian New Guinea, in 1974. When I first met Awuchinam, a well-known person who in his earlier youth had been a headhunter, but when I met him he was in grandfatherly mode. He was wearing a derby that he'd gotten from a British traveler, and he was smoking a pipe, and he had a sport coat like this that he was wearing. And he said to me one day, in Indonesian, I'm going to use that as the lingua franca there, "I'd like to take you somewhere in my canoe." I thought, uh-oh, if he wants me to paddle, watch out. I'm not a good canoe paddler on the rough waters of New Guinea. So don't worry, I'll paddle. You ride. He said, "I'm taking you upriver." I said, wow, this is going to be great. Because I kind of saw this guy as a grandfatherly type of figure, and he kind of took me under his wing as a doctoral student then. We paddled upriver about 3 or 4 miles. And he said, "Get out here." He said, "Look at that tree." So there's a huge singular cayubesi, that means an ironwood tree, a hardwood tree. Mahogany quality tree. It was 100 feet tall. He said, "I want you to look at that tree. Don't ever forget it whenever you think of me. That's my tree." And he said, I now live in Indonesia, and the Indonesians own this, they tell me, they own this land. The land of Papua." He said, "Maybe yes, maybe no, but I own that tree. Nobody can take that tree away from me." Oh, well, I kept my promise. I never forgot him. I've told you his story again. Because that's what it means to have some sense of indigenous rights and indigenous ownership and indigenous belief. Now, about that time, I met the second person mentioned on your handout, Tom Benoit. The Catholic missionaries in that area were nice enough to fly me around in their airplane. I'm not a missionary, but they were friends of mine, and they helped me get from point A to point B. And one day, Tom Benoit said, as we were come out of his Cessna, we're standing on the little mud and grass airstrip, "I want to show you, I'll draw a little map for you, I'll draw a handmade map, where the tensions are in this area that revolve around self-determination and the people's movements." And I thought, wow, this will be the first time, even though my doctorate was on a related topic, more akin to what you talked about in terms of land rights and socioeconomic development. Still, I thought, wow, I don't want to miss the chance to learn more about rights movements, about social movements. And Tom Benoit sketched for me on this map of Western New Guinea several sites where guerrillas were operative. And I remember the first thing I thought of was, isn't this something? A headhunter who's a guerrilla. You know, using the labels that people use for pro and for con. You know, I'm saying these lightheartedly, but with serious intent. A headhunter who's become a guerrilla. Oh, what does this mean? And Tom Benoit placed this map. He said, I'm even worried to sharing this with you because this is such a burgeoning problem, and the movement between the guerrilla fighters, between the rebels, and amongst the Indonesians who are here, and increasingly pressuring the people here, is ominous. He said, but this is where things are bubbling, in the jungle. Di dalam hutan ini. And those were the strongholds of the OPM, which you'll see on my handout near the bottom. The Organisasi Papua Merdeka, that means the Organization of Freedom for Papua, OPM. And the OPM became, beginning in about 1965, the primary freedom movement for persons of what we now call Papua Indonesia, Western New Guinea. And at about that same time, as I started to learn a bit about this, I learned that refugees were fleeing from Indonesian New Guinea into the relatively new nation of Papua New Guinea. In fact, officially, the new nation of Papua New Guinea was chartered in about, as I recall, 1974, 1975, just about the time I was there, the first time. And so, here we had, in some cases, refugees come guerrillas, come headhunters. Some claim to be all of those things in one man or one woman under duress. Wow, this is so fascinating to me at that time. Shortly thereafter, Tom Benoit died in a plane crash. And several of the people I'm going to talk about, I met many of these personally or chatted with them. Some of the people I'm going to reference I didn't meet personally. So many of these people have died or been killed in seeking sovereignty, in seeking self-determination, in seeking merdeka, freedom, as they define it and as they use the word in Indonesian, merdeka. Arnold App, who's on my sheet there, was the next person I met shortly thereafter. And Arnold App was an indigenous man of Papua. I met him at the steps of the Universitas Cenderawasih, the University of Cenderawasih. Cenderawasih in Indonesian means bird of paradise. So I met him at the steps of the Bird of Paradise University. A terrific fellow. The first thing he showed me was his war shield that he kept as a kind of souvenir based on his, tribal affiliations and the things he'd done. And he said, I'm now forming a museum of artifacts for indigenous people. And my wife Kathy was with me at this time now. And we looked at Arnold App's museum. And we studied his artifacts that he collected from many tribal peoples of Papua. And then we talked about his dream of merdeka for Indonesian people. In fact, he was a bit humble. Arnold App, as I came to quickly find out by talking to others, was one of Papua's leading human rights spokesmen. And yes, not long thereafter, Arnold App was killed for his outspoken advocacy for indigenous rights. But we haven't forgotten him, and I dedicated one of my books to him. So you can see how things are bubbling now over a 40-some year period, and how there's a foundation of concern, and that concern's primarily directed toward Indonesia, the governing power, a power now that has well over 250 million people in the overall archipelago, of course, of Indonesia, with the most outlying of the provinces being Papua, the most extreme east outlier. Picture your mental maps. Directly north of Australia, there's that island of New Guinea, and this is the western half. Things were bubbling in a kind of neo-colonial, deterministic way. I was in Hawaii at about that time, traveling to and fro, staying at a nice lady's house who's a professor helping different people who are interested in Indonesia. And one morning I got up and she had several students there that she was helping who were passing through, who were based in Hawaii or on their way to Indonesia or whatnot. Alice Dewey was her name. And I began doing the dishes because everybody staying there always helped do the dishes. And I did the dishes like every other good person who was staying there doing the dishes because the rent was, you couldn't beat the rent she charged me. Zero. So I thought the least I could do is help do the dishes. And I stood next to a lady who was helping do the dishes. I thought, oh, she's a lovely lady. She has a certainly unusual name. Stanley. Seemed to be her first name. Well, it proved to be Barack Obama's mother. Which I didn't know, of course, till many years later. So I did dishes with Barack Obama's mother, who had a strong interest in Indonesia. Of course, as many of you know, Barack's mother was an anthropologist, and while I didn't get to know her well, it's interesting to say that Barack's stepfather, a man named Lolo, who you'll see, I put Lolo / Obama here on the list for you to see, in fact, served a tour as an Indonesian soldier, you guessed it, in Papua. The strange connections that the world has for us that we think about as we try to do this and try to think of it personally, not just conceptually, which is very important, but personally. As I became more knowledgeable about all of these issues and about what was troubling people, logging. The logging of those trees that Owuchanam had first alerted me to his singular Cayubesi tree, was ominous. And the logging issues were so ominous that in the mid-70s and on into the 80s and 90s, logging companies, some of which were linked to Japan, Singapore, Australia, and or Indonesia, were clear-cutting key swaths of this Indonesian Papuan rainforest with very select species, including the hardwoods, in ways that you could not replace it. A hardwood like Owuchanam showed me that was 100 feet tall, was 150 years old. You just can't replant that seedling and expect it to sprout up like a pine tree. And the logging was being done under ominous emphasis where indigenous people were being recruited with such things as, you'll get a new pair of tennis shoes, you'll get tobacco for a week, and you'll get a new machete if you just come to work for our logging company. Well, we know how disruptive that can be and how misleading that can be, especially for persons not familiar with capitalizing economies. And many people were taken advantage of. One day, my wife Kathy and I, with the aid of a Catholic missionary friend named Dave Gallus, hid behind a little shed in the village of Ewer and filmed. I had a little simple 8mm silent camera that I brought, film camera, and we filmed the beatings that Indonesian officials were inflicting on indigenous persons for not keeping up the pace on the logging initiatives, for not getting in enough logs that week. And my wife and I filmed these beatings secretly, and who could we turn the film into that would make a difference? The Indonesian government? Not. They were the perpetrators of this. We gave our film and talked to the bishop, the Catholic bishop of the area, whose name you'll see, an old friend of mine named Alphonse Savada, and he spoke up. And he had enough power as a Catholic bishop to do something. And he did. And my wife and I were glad to make a very small contribution to the improvement of that particular set of beatings, and elimination of that kind of beating, at least there. So this is a situation that has continued in very many ways till today. Over this period of time, there have been in Melanesia, because of course this is also Melanesia culturally. Glad you referenced those anthropologists, because being an anthropologist, we're glad to ever get referenced whenever we can be referenced. We're interested in millenarian movements, in messianic movements, in cargo cults. I see several people nodding. You know what I'm speaking about. And there have been many messianic movements and cargo cults in this area. And those messianic movements are framed, as we saw, and I published this if you'd like to read my article. We don't have time to go through it today. In the journal, The Applied Anthropologist, about 3 years ago, you can read my writings on a particular cargo cult, a particularly messianic movement, framed by indigenous persons who are then speaking out on behalf of their fellow men and women, trying to bring the millennium, in a sense, to the village, trying to bring in barang, that's goods, the kind of barang that they see all the outsiders have, all those appliances and goodies that outsiders have, and bring them often under a religious rubric, often a Christian rubric. The man I interviewed brought it under the rubric of Jesus. Jesus was going to walk again in his village. And when Jesus walked again, barang, goods, would flow to the deserving people who had been oppressed. A classic cargo cult, a classic messianic or millenarian movement. Well, the final few things I want to say, and I think we'll just be right about on time, Bill. General Thaddeus Yogi formed a Papuan Freedom Fighters guerrilla army. And General Thaddeus Yogi's army was hidden in the northern jungles, not far from where my friend originally showed me that map, to fight back. And he had an army of men armed with weapons, spears and guns, and he was ready to fight back for Papuan freedom. He didn't have much luck. Thais Elway, you see his name there. This isn't the Elway we know in Colorado. This is a different Elway. It's spelled a little differently, E-L-U-A-Y. Thais Elway, also from guerrilla foundations. He became a politician, and he tried to bridge the guerrilla movement and the Indonesian movement, and tried to be a stepping stone. And he was assassinated in 2001. And Rick and Patsy Spear. Patsy Spear was a student at Korbel. Before it was called Korbel, but it was called GSIS. She was a student of mine. Patsy Spear's husband, Rick, was murdered in Papua in 2002 at the steps of the Freeport-McMoran mine. The name Freeport-McMoran's on your handout. One of the world's largest mines involving copper and gold. And a tremendous source of wealth and of problems for the people, particularly the indigenous people, who don't get to tap the local wealth extracted by Freeport-McMoran. And there's Deki Pigome. Deki Pigome picked the name Freeport because he thought it had power. And Deki Pigome founded an organization called Freeport Yawudi Nota to produce sweet potatoes to export to the world. And Deki Pigome said, I'm doing Papuan foreign aid beyond. Wow, what a guy. What a grand notion. His sweet potatoes didn't go very far, but what a notion. He didn't want someone else's foreign aid. He wanted to produce foreign aid in the form of exported sweet potatoes. And the final is the itchy old man. That's, in English, of course, there's an Indonesian phrase for it. The itchy old man is a metaphor for a legendary character who talked about everything in Papua from vampires and ominous beings that come and descend upon people, both the invaders and the indigenous, to the messianic movements and the need for messianic movements to help free people, to free indigenous people of what they perceive to be colonial, and in this case with Indonesia, post-colonial oppression. Thank you very much.